We build everything here from Superbirds, original stuff, and then we got one section of our business up here, just modified
In
new
Level
cars.
Cross, North Carolina, a town so small it barely qualifies as a town, there is a stretch of land where a family built the most dominant racing dynasty in American motorsport history. On that land sits a working garage, a restoration shop, and a museum that most NASCAR fans have never visited, because most NASCAR fans have never heard of Level Cross at all. But inside that compound is a collection of cars, tools, and personal artifacts that traces one family's entire relationship with speed, risk, and loss across 4 generations. This is the story of what's actually in there, what's known, what's rumored, and why the man at the center of it all has spent his whole life deciding what the public gets to see. Before any of this makes sense, you need the scale of what Richard Petty actually did in a race car, because without it, a garage full of old Dodges and Plymouths is just a garage full of old Dodges and Plymouths. 200. That's how many NASCAR Cup Series races Richard Petty won across a career that ran from 1958 to 1992. The second-place driver on that all-time list, David Pearson, won 105. Petty didn't edge out the competition. He nearly doubled the total of the next best driver who ever lived, and nobody has come remotely close since. He won 7 Cup Series championships. He won the Daytona 500 7 times. He started 1,184 races and finished 513 of them in a row without missing a single one, a streak that ran from 1971 to 1989. These aren't records that get chased anymore. They're treated the way people treat a mountain range, as a fixed part of the landscape rather than a target. None of that happened in a vacuum. Petty Enterprises, the family operation his father Lee founded in Level Cross in 1949, became the winningest team in NASCAR history. Lee Petty won 3 championships of his own before Richard ever got behind a wheel, and Lee actually won the first Daytona 500 ever run in 1959. Richard's brother Maurice built and tuned the engines behind most of those 200 wins. Their cousin Dale Inman served as Richard's crew chief for the majority of his career and is considered one of the greatest strategists the sport has ever had. For members of one family from one small town, all ended up in the NASCAR Hall of Fame. And the physical compound where it all happened, where cars were built by hand, tested, and sent out to dominate the sport for decades, is still standing. Here's where the story usually gets exaggerated. So it's worth being precise about what actually exists at Level Cross, because the real version is strange enough on its own. Richard's late wife, Linda Petty, established the Richard Petty Museum in the late 1980s, originally right there in Level Cross. In 2003, when Petty Enterprises needed the space for the racing operation, the museum relocated to nearby Randleman. In 2014, it moved back to Level Cross, into a complex built around the original A-frame building that once housed Petty Engineering, and next to the house where Richard and Maurice were actually born. That museum is open to the public. Visitors who make the trip report the same thing over and over. Championship cars on display, walls of trophies, uniforms and helmets, an extensive knife and firearm collection Petty built up as a genuine hobby, and more than a few times the chance to actually meet Richard Petty in person, because he still shows up and talks to fans who make the drive. But surrounding that public museum is the working shop, Petty's Garage, which took over the compound's operational role after Petty Enterprises effectively wound down its Cup Series involvement in the 2000s. Petty's Garage does restoration and custom-build work today, and it sits inside the same historic shop bays where Lee, Richard, and Maurice built race cars by hand. Visitors can walk through parts of it and see the original tools and workbenches still there. That part is real, documented, and open to the public in limited form. What is an open? And what has fed years of speculation among collectors and fans is everything that exists outside the curated museum path, cars, parts, and personal items that never made it onto a display floor, either because they weren't in good enough condition to show, or because Petty never wanted them shown in the first place. Petty has said publicly more than once that in the 1960s and 70s nobody thought about preserving old race cars. A used car was a used car. Teams needed cash to build the next one, so cars got sold off, stripped for parts, or simply left where they sat. He's admitted some went to West Coast racers for whatever price he could get, because at the time nobody imagined a beat-up stock car would ever be worth real money. Some of what didn't get sold ended up parked and forgotten around the property for decades. That part isn't rumor. That's Richard Petty on the record, talking about his own regret over what wasn't saved. One vehicle that is confirmed and does exist at Level Cross is tied to the very beginning of Richard's career, a 1957 Oldsmobile 88, the type of car Petty drove in his rookie NASCAR season. The museum displays a version of it. Sources differ on whether it's the original or a faithful recreation built to the same specifications, which is itself telling, because it shows how much of this history exists in a gray zone between preserved and reconstructed. Built with a removable hardtop, so it could compete in either the convertible or hardtop series, a design quirk unique to that early improvisational era of stock car racing. It represents the exact moment a 20-year-old from a town nobody outside racing had heard a first strapped into a car and found out what he could do. At the other end of the timeline sits the museum's Plymouth Superbird, one of the rarest and most recognizable cars in NASCAR history. Built in 1970 specifically to exploit the sport's rules around aerodynamics, the Superbird's pointed nose cone and towering rear wing weren't styling flourishes. They were Chrysler engineering decisions meant to cut drag and add downforce at speeds approaching 200 miles an hour. Petty drove Plymouth products to 18 wins that season, and the Superbird became permanently linked with his number 43 in a way almost nothing else in his career matches. It sits in the museum today as one of the genuine centerpieces of the collection, the peak of what Petty became, parked a short walk from the car that started it all. Here's the part of this story that most breathless hidden garage content leaves out entirely, because it complicates the mystery. Richard Petty has, in fact, sold pieces of his personal collection. In 2018, at 80 years old, he consigned a batch of items to a Las Vegas auction, including his 1974 Dodge Charger. The Dayglow red and Petty blue car he drove to 31 wins that season, including his 5th Daytona 500, along with a 1981 Daytona 500 trophy, championship rings, watches, knives, and uniforms. His explanation wasn't sentimental. He told reporters he'd simply been accumulating stuff for 80 years and had more cars and memorabilia than his own museum could display. That's not the story of a man clinging to every object out of grief. It's the story of a working collector managing an enormous physical archive, the same way any long-lived institution eventually has to. That detail matters because it reframes the whole mystery. The parts of the Petty collection that stay private aren't private because Richard Petty refuses all offers on principle. He's demonstrably willing to sell when he decides something has run its course. What stays back is what he's decided isn't for sale, which is a very different and more interesting thing than blanket secrecy. It suggests a man making deliberate, ongoing decisions about which pieces of his own history are archive material and which pieces are still, in some sense, alive to him. No honest account of the Petty family and what they choose to keep private can skip past May of 2000, because it changed the emotional register of everything connected to that family compound. Adam Petty, Richard's grandson and Kyle Petty's son, was killed during a practice session at New Hampshire Motor Speedway when his throttle stuck and his car struck the outside wall at speed. He was 20 years old, already racing professionally, and was the first fourth-generation athlete in any major American sport. He died before most fans who would eventually have followed his career had any real chance to know who he was. The Petty Museum today includes dedicated space honoring Adam alongside Lee and Kyle, which tells you plainly that his death isn't something the family has tried to erase from the public story. It's something they've built into it deliberately on their own terms. Kyle Petty has spoken over the years about what it meant to race under his father's shadow, winning 8 Cup Series races across an 18-year career that would be a strong resume for almost anyone else, and was instead constantly measured against Richard's 200. He's also spoken about how differently he experiences the family compound compared to fans and collectors who see it purely as history. For Kyle, the tools on the walls of that shop are the tools he watched his father and uncle actually use. The cars aren't museum pieces to him first. They're the cars he grew up around before they were anything else. That distinction between an artifact and a memory that happens to be sitting in a garage is probably the single most honest way to understand why some things at Level Cross stay out of public view. It isn't always about market value or mystery. Sometimes it's just that a workshop is also a family's living room, and not every living room needs visitors. Richard Petty turned 86 in 2024, and by every account from people who've actually met him at the museum, remains exactly what his public image suggests: the cowboy hat, the dark sunglasses that became part of the visual language of American motorsport, and a willingness to stop and talk to fans that has held up for decades after he stopped needing to do it for his career. Visitors describe him as unusually generous with his time for a man of his stature in the sport, someone who signs autographs and takes photos not because a handler tells him to, but because, by his own account, he genuinely likes the people who make the trip to find him. Petty's Garage, the shop that effectively replaced the old racing operation after Petty Enterprises scaled back in the 2000s, continues doing restoration and custom-build work inside that same historic complex. Maurice Petty and Dale Inman, both in their 80s, have continued to be involved with projects tied to the family's history. The recreation of one of Richard's championship-era Plymouths, for instance, has reportedly drawn on both original specifications and the two men's direct memory of how those cars were actually built, which is about as close as it gets to living history in American motorsport. 3 Hall of Famers working from memory, in the same building where the originals were built 60 years earlier. That's not folklore. That's simply what's still happening at Level Cross today. The tempting version of this story is the one where a legendary driver hoards a secret trove nobody's allowed to see, and the reveal is the whole point. The more accurate version is less cinematic and more interesting. A family that built the most statistically dominant career in the history of American racing, then spent the following decades making constant, deliberate choices about what belongs in a public museum, what belongs in a working shop still doing real business, and what simply belongs to them. Some of that private material has been sold when Petty decided it had run its course. Some of it stays back because it's tied to people who are gone, work that's still ongoing, or a version of the family's history that was never really meant for an audience in the first place. Most of what gets called legacy in American sports lives in highlight reels and record books, built to be consumed by people who were never actually there. Richard Petty built the most dominant career the sport has ever produced, and then spent the rest of his life quietly deciding, piece by piece, what part of that story the public gets to walk through, and what part simply stays home in Level Cross. If Petty's Garage ever puts everything from that compound on public display at once, would it actually change how we understand what it costs to become the winningest driver NASCAR has ever seen? Or would it just confirm what careful visitors to that little museum in North Carolina have suspected for years?